For 30 years, not a single patient has died inside St. Augustine Hospital. Not one heart stopped, not one flatline echoed through its halls. But when people leave, they are not the same people who entered. Something inside that hospital keeps bodies alive. And something far older is feeding on what makes them human.
Welcome to Horror Audiobook.
For 3 decades, one remote hospital has achieved what every medical institution in the world considers impossible: 0 deaths. Doctors call it a miracle. News outlets call it a medical revolution. But the survivors tell a different story. Patients leave cured of disease, but stripped of emotion, memories, and sometimes even their personalities. Families say their loved ones come back empty. Tonight's story follows a journalist who travels to investigate the hospital that defeated death, only to discover a truth buried beneath the building itself. A sealed underground ward. A hidden patient that never left. And a hospital that doesn't save lives. It harvests souls. Chapter 1. The Hospital That Defied Death. The headline appeared on Clara Whitmore's screen at exactly 2:13 in the morning. Most people would have scrolled past it. The internet was full of miracle cures and exaggerated claims, each louder than the last. But something about this one made her pause. The article was simple, no flashy language, no desperate promises. Just a number. 30 years. 30 years without a single recorded death inside the walls of St. Augustine Hospital. Clara leaned back in her chair, the faint glow of her laptop illuminating the cramped apartment around her. Outside her window, rain tapped softly against the glass like impatient fingers. 30 years. Hospitals were places where people went to die almost as often as they went to recover. Machines failed. Bodies gave up. Doctors made mistakes. Death was a constant visitor in every medical building on Earth. But according to this article, St. Augustine Hospital had somehow shut the door on it. Not one patient. Not one flatline. Not a single death certificate. Clara read the sentence again. Then again. Her profession had trained her to distrust miracles. She was a journalist, and journalists survived by asking questions nobody else wanted to ask. The article claimed the hospital sat in a remote mountain valley several hours from the nearest major city. It had been founded 30 years ago by a brilliant and controversial neurologist named Dr. Elias Harrow. Since its opening day, the hospital had recorded what doctors called the most statistically impossible survival rate in medical history. Every patient lived. Terminal cancer patients, cardiac arrest victims, people with infections so severe their organs had begun shutting down. They all walked out alive. The article ended with a sentence that made Clara feel something she couldn't quite name. In a world where death remains medicine's greatest enemy, St. Augustine Hospital appears to have finally defeated it. She closed the laptop. The rain outside grew heavier. Clara sat quietly in the darkness, thinking. Because in 15 years of reporting, she had learned one thing about miracles. They were almost always hiding something. 2 days later, Clara sat across from her first survivor. The man introduced himself as Daniel Keene, 53 years old, former construction worker, recently recovered from stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The kind that rarely gave people a second chance. They met in a quiet cafe near the train station. The afternoon crowd buzzed around them, cups clinking and chairs scraping across tile floors. Daniel sat perfectly still. Clara had interviewed dozens of cancer survivors before. Most of them carried a certain energy, an overwhelming gratitude for life that filled every conversation. Daniel didn't. He stared calmly at the coffee in front of him as if it were a neutral object, His face showed no excitement, no relief, just quiet stillness. Clara clicked her recorder on. "So," she said gently, "the doctors told you the cancer was terminal before you went to St. Augustine." Daniel nodded. "Yes. And now, it's gone." Clara waited. Usually this was the moment survivors described the miracle, the moment hope returned, the moment doctors couldn't explain what had happened. But Daniel said nothing more. "You must feel incredibly lucky," Clara offered. Daniel lifted his eyes slowly. "I suppose." His voice carried no emotion. Clara shifted in her seat. "Can you describe the treatment?" Daniel stared past her for a moment, as if searching for a memory that had grown distant. "I stayed there for 12 days. And what happened during those 12 days? Tests, monitoring, any experimental procedure?" "No." Clara frowned slightly. "No surgeries, no unusual treatments." Daniel shook his head. "No." Clara leaned forward. "Then how did they cure the cancer?" Daniel looked down again. His fingers slowly rotated the untouched coffee cup. Finally he spoke. "I don't know." The answer hung in the air. Clara had interviewed thousands of people in her career, and something about Daniel's tone unsettled her. It wasn't uncertainty. It was absence, like someone describing a memory that had been erased. "Do you remember your time there?" she asked. Daniel thought about the question. "Yes." "Then what do you remember?" He looked directly at her. For the first time, Clara felt something shift in the conversation. Something colder. "The hospital was quiet," he said, "very quiet." Clara scribbled a note. "Anything else?" Daniel hesitated. Then he said something that made Clara stop writing. "Sometimes at night," he said slowly, "I thought I heard breathing in the walls." Clara looked up. "Breathing?" Daniel shrugged slightly. "I was very sick. Maybe it was the machines." The cafe noise continued around them. But Clara suddenly felt as though the room had grown smaller. "After the treatment," she asked carefully, "how did you feel?" Daniel answered immediately. "Better. Physically. Yes. And emotionally." Daniel paused. It was a long pause. Long enough that Clara wondered if he hadn't heard the question. Finally, he said something strange. "I feel neutral." Clara blinked. "Neutral?" Daniel nodded. "I wake up every day. I eat, I sleep, I go for walks." "But—" He stared at the table. "But nothing." Clara studied him carefully. "What about happiness?" Daniel didn't answer. "What about fear?" Still nothing. "What about love?" she asked. Daniel finally met her eyes again. "I remember what those things felt like." The way he said it made Clara's skin prickle. "Remember?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "And now?" Daniel considered the question. Then he spoke the sentence Clara would hear again and again over the next several weeks. The sentence that began to appear in every interview. The phrase that followed survivors like a shadow. Daniel leaned back in his chair. His voice was calm. "Flat. Empty. I survived," he said. Then he added quietly, "But something stayed behind." Clara interviewed 12 more survivors over the next 2 weeks. Different ages, different illnesses, different lives. But every conversation felt strangely identical. They all survived diseases that should have killed them. They all left St. Augustine Hospital completely cured. And every one of them felt wrong. One woman described watching her husband cry after she returned home. "I knew I should comfort him," she told Clara, her voice dull, but I didn't feel anything. A young man who had survived heart failure described standing at his father's funeral 2 months later. I understood I was supposed to grieve, he said calmly, but it felt like watching someone else's life. Another survivor explained it in a way Clara couldn't forget. It's like the volume of life got turned down. Clara filled notebook after notebook with observations. But one pattern emerged above everything else. Every survivor repeated some version of the same sentence. Sometimes word for word. Sometimes slightly different. But always the same idea. I survived. But something stayed behind. 3 weeks after she first saw the headline, Clara finally looked up the man responsible for the miracle. Dr. Elias Harrow, the founder of St. Augustine Hospital. The doctor who had somehow done what medicine had failed to do for thousands of years. His photograph appeared on her screen. Tall, thin, silver hair combed neatly back. Sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses. A man who looked more like a philosopher than a physician. The article beneath the photo described him as a visionary, a pioneer of neurological stabilization, a doctor who believed the human brain held the key to defeating death itself. Clara stared at the picture. Something about the man's expression unsettled her. Not arrogance, not pride. Something else. Something quieter. Almost like acceptance. Her phone buzzed suddenly. An email notification appeared. Subject: interview request approved. Clara opened it quickly. The message was short. Miss Whitmore, Dr. Harrow has agreed to grant you a single interview regarding St. Augustine Hospital and its treatment program. You are welcome to visit the facility next week. Clara read the message twice. Then she noticed the final sentence. Please understand, not all areas of the hospital are open to visitors. Clara slowly closed the laptop. Outside, the rain had stopped. But the air felt heavier. Because somewhere far from the city, there was a hospital where no one died. And the deeper Clara looked into its miracle, the more it began to feel like something else entirely. Something colder. Something waiting. And though she didn't know it yet, the real story wasn't about the patients who survived. It was about what the hospital had taken from them, and where those missing pieces had gone. Chapter 2. The survivors who came back whole. The first thing Clara Whitmore noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary kind, the absence of conversation or traffic, but something deeper, a silence inside people. It began with the eyes. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara interviewed survivor after survivor from St. Augustine Hospital, 12 in total, different illnesses, different ages, different lives before their treatment. But when she sat across from them, they all seemed to share the same strange stillness. Their bodies were healthy. Their minds were alert. But their eyes looked like abandoned houses. The fourth interview took place in a small suburban living room on the edge of town. Clara sat across from Margaret Cole, a woman in her early 60s who had survived advanced lung disease. The house smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Family photographs filled the shelves behind Margaret, birthday parties, beach vacations, grandchildren smiling at the camera. Margaret followed Clara's gaze. That was before the hospital, she said. Her voice carried the same calm monotone Clara had begun to recognize. Before, Clara asked. Margaret nodded. Clara turned her recorder on. Your doctor said you had less than 6 months to live. Yes. And then you went to St. Augustine. Yes. How long were you there? 10 days. Clara flipped a page in her notebook. And when you left, the disease was gone. Margaret inhaled slowly. Yes. The word lingered in the quiet room. Clara waited. Again, the same strange pattern repeated. Survivors never volunteered details. Every answer had to be pulled out carefully, like fragile glass from deep water. What do you remember about the treatment? Clara asked. Margaret stared toward the hallway behind Clara. For a moment, Clara wondered if the older woman had forgotten the question. Then Margaret spoke. The doctors were kind. That's good. They checked my vitals every few hours. Did you receive any experimental medication? No. Any surgical procedures? No. Clara frowned. Then how did they cure the disease? Margaret blinked slowly. I don't know. That answer again. Clara wrote the words in her notebook. I don't know. The sentence appeared again and again in her interviews, like a missing puzzle piece nobody could remember losing. Clara leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Cole, when you returned home, what was the first thing you felt? Margaret considered the question. Her fingers rested quietly in her lap. My husband cried, she said finally. Clara glanced at a photograph on the wall, Margaret standing beside a gray-haired man, both laughing at something outside the frame. What did you feel when he cried? Clara asked. Margaret looked down at her hands. Nothing. Clara felt a small chill travel down her spine. Nothing, she repeated. Margaret shook her head gently. I understood he was happy. But you didn't feel happy. No. Clara hesitated. What about relief? No. What about gratitude? Margaret's expression didn't change. I remember those feelings, she said quietly. Remember? Clara asked. Yes. But you don't feel them anymore. Margaret looked up. Her eyes were steady, calm, and disturbingly empty. It's like they belong to someone else now. Later that afternoon, Clara spoke with Margaret's husband in the kitchen, while Margaret sat silently in the living room. The man's name was Edward Cole. He gripped a coffee mug tightly as he spoke. At first we thought she was just adjusting, he said. Clara leaned against the counter, listening carefully. She survived something that should have killed her, Edward continued. We assumed it would take time to process that. What changed your mind? Clara asked. Edward glanced toward the living room. Margaret sat exactly where Clara had left her, staring quietly at the window. She doesn't laugh anymore. Clara said nothing. She used to laugh all the time, Edward continued softly, even at stupid jokes, especially at stupid jokes. He took a sip of coffee. But now, he struggled to finish the sentence. She smiles sometimes, he said finally, but it's like watching someone imitate a smile. Clara wrote the phrase down. Imitate. Edward leaned closer. There's something else. What? Clara asked. Edward lowered his voice. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and she's sitting on the edge of the bed. Clara looked up. Just sitting there. Edward nodded slowly. Looking at the wall. Does she say anything? No. Have you asked her what she's doing? Edward stared into his coffee mug. She says she can't sleep. Clara waited. But the strange part, Edward whispered, is that she doesn't look tired. The seventh survivor lived in a small apartment above a grocery store. His name was Leo Martinez, 28 years old. 2 months earlier, Leo had suffered massive heart failure during a marathon. Doctors declared him unlikely to survive the night. Then St. Augustine Hospital accepted his case. Now Leo opened the door with perfect health. He looked strong, athletic, completely recovered. But when Clara shook his hand, she noticed something strange. His grip was gentle. Too gentle. Like someone who had learned the motion but forgotten the feeling behind it. They sat in his living room. Sports trophies lined the shelves behind him. Clara switched on the recorder. "Leo, do you remember your heart stopping?" she asked. "Yes." "Do you remember being transferred to St. Augustine?" "Yes." "What happened when you arrived?" Leo shrugged. "They monitored me." "For how long?" 9 days. "And when you left?" "The heart damage was gone." Clara leaned forward. "Do you remember how they fixed it?" Leo shook his head. "No." Again. The same missing explanation. Clara studied him carefully. "Your parents told me you used to run marathons every year." "Yes." "Have you run since the treatment?" Leo looked at the floor. "No." "Why not?" Leo answered simply. "I don't see the point." Clara frowned. "You used to love running." "Yes." "But now?" Leo lifted his shoulders slightly. "It doesn't feel like anything." Clara sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked the question she had begun asking every survivor. "When you left the hospital, what changed?" Leo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window. The afternoon sun shone brightly across the city rooftops. After a long silence, Leo spoke. "I survived." Clara nodded slowly. Then Leo finished the sentence. "But something stayed behind." By the end of the second week, Clara's apartment had transformed into a small archive of disturbing patterns. Photographs, audio recordings, interview transcripts, medical records. Every piece of information pointed to the same impossible conclusion. The hospital cured people, but the cure always came with the same side effect. Emptiness. Clara replayed one of the recordings late that night. The voice belonged to a survivor named Nathan Wu. He had survived a brain tumor that doctors believed would kill him within weeks. Now he spoke calmly into Clara's recorder. "You know what the strangest part is?" Nathan said on the tape. "What?" Clara's recorded voice asked. Nathan answered quietly. "I know I should be grateful." Clara leaned closer to the speaker. "But I can't feel it." The recording continued. "I remember loving my parents," Nathan said. "I remember feeling afraid when the doctors told me I was dying." A pause followed. Then he said something Clara couldn't forget. "But those emotions feel like old photographs now." The tape clicked off. Clara sat alone in the dim apartment. The rain had started again outside. She stared at the growing pile of notes across her desk. Every survivor described the same quiet transformation. Their bodies returned to perfect health. But something invisible had vanished from them. Something emotional. Something human. Clara rubbed her temples. The article had called St. Augustine Hospital a miracle. But miracles didn't leave people hollow. Miracles didn't erase love. And miracles definitely didn't make people feel like strangers inside their own lives. Clara reached for the hospital records again. Her eyes stopped on a single line. A statistic repeated in every report. 30 years. 0 deaths. She whispered the number aloud. 30 years. The words echoed faintly through the apartment. Then a thought crept quietly into her mind. If nobody had died in that hospital for 3 decades, then what exactly had replaced death? And somewhere far away in the mountains, inside a quiet hospital where machines hummed through the night, something waited patiently, feeding, growing, and slowly becoming stronger with every patient who walked out alive. Chapter 3. The doctor who won't answer questions. The road to St. Augustine Hospital wound through mountains that seemed older than memory. Clara Whitmore drove alone. The city had disappeared behind her hours ago, replaced by long stretches of forest and narrow highways that twisted like dark ribbons through the hills. The deeper she traveled, the quieter the world became. Cell service vanished first. Then radio stations faded into static. Soon the only sound inside the car was the steady hum of the engine and the distant whisper of wind against the windows. Clara checked the GPS again. 16 miles remaining. She glanced up at the mountains rising around her. It was an unusual place for a world-famous hospital. Most medical institutions thrived in large cities, surrounded by universities and research centers. But St. Augustine had been built far from everything. Isolated, hidden, almost as if it had been placed deliberately out of reach. The road curved sharply around a hillside. And then Clara saw it. St. Augustine Hospital stood alone in a wide valley. The building was enormous. White stone walls rose 4 stories high, their surfaces gleaming faintly in the gray afternoon light. Long rows of windows stretched across the structure like watchful eyes. The architecture looked modern, but something about it felt older. Too symmetrical. Too perfect. The hospital resembled a monument more than a medical facility. Clara slowed the car as she approached the entrance. The grounds were immaculate. Perfectly trimmed grass. Neatly arranged flower beds. Not a single piece of trash or fallen branch anywhere. Even the trees seemed carefully spaced. Everything about the place suggested control. Precision. Order. Clara parked near the front doors and stepped out of the car. The mountain air felt colder than she expected. The wind carried a faint smell she couldn't immediately place. Something sterile. Like antiseptic. But beneath it lingered another scent. Something older. Something damp. She shook the thought away and walked toward the entrance. The glass doors slid open silently. Inside, the hospital lobby was even quieter than the mountains outside. The first thing Clara noticed was the lack of sound. Hospitals were normally chaotic places. Phones ringing. Machines beeping. Doctors shouting instructions. Patients coughing, crying, breathing. But St. Augustine felt strangely calm. The lobby was large and spotless, with polished marble floors reflecting the overhead lights. A few nurses moved through the hallway beyond the reception desk. Their footsteps were soft. Their voices low. No one seemed rushed. No one seemed stressed. In fact, they all seemed unusually composed. A receptionist greeted Clara with a polite smile. "You must be Miss Whitmore." Clara nodded. "Yes. Dr. Harrow is expecting you." The receptionist gestured toward the elevators at the far end of the lobby. "4th floor." Clara thanked her and walked across the marble floor. Her footsteps echoed faintly. As she approached the elevators, she noticed something odd. The buttons listed only 4 floors. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing unusual about that, except Clara had reviewed the building blueprints before arriving. According to those documents, the hospital had 5 floors. 4 above ground. And 1 below. She studied the panel again. No basement button. Just the 4 numbered floors. Clara pressed 4. The elevator doors closed with a quiet hiss. As the elevator began to rise, she noticed a faint vibration beneath her feet. A low mechanical hum. It almost sounded like machinery operating somewhere deep beneath the building. The elevator stopped. The doors slid open. The 4th floor hallway was even quieter than the lobby. Soft lighting filled the corridor. Framed medical certificates lined the walls. At the end of the hallway stood a pair of wooden double doors. A brass plaque beside them read, Dr. Elias Harrow. Director. Clara took a breath. Then she knocked. A calm voice answered from inside. Come in. Dr. Elias Harrow stood by the window when Clara entered. He was taller than she expected. Thin. Elegant in posture. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his dark suit looked perfectly pressed. When he turned toward her, Clara noticed his eyes immediately. Sharp. Observant. The kind of eyes that studied people, the way scientists studied specimens. Miss Whitmore, he said warmly, thank you for making the trip. His voice was smooth and controlled. Clara shook his hand. His grip was firm. Confident. Thank you for agreeing to the interview, she replied. Dr. Harrow gestured toward a chair across from his desk. Please. Clara sat. The office was immaculate. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with medical journals and neurological textbooks. The desk was almost completely empty, no clutter, no scattered papers. Everything about the room reflected the same quiet order she had seen throughout the hospital. Clara placed her recorder on the desk. Is it all right if I record our conversation? Dr. Harrow smiled slightly. Of course. The recorder clicked on. Clara began with the obvious question. Dr. Harrow, since Augustine Hospital has maintained a perfect survival rate for 30 years. Many experts call it the greatest achievement in modern medicine. Harrow folded his hands. We do our best. Clara waited for more. None came. What makes your treatment methods different? She asked. Focus. Focus. Yes. He leaned back in his chair. Most hospitals treat symptoms, he explained. We treat the system itself. Clara scribbled notes. And what system is that? The brain. Clara looked up. The brain controls every biological function in the human body, Harrow continued. Heart rate, immune response, cellular repair. He tapped the desk lightly. If the brain is stabilized correctly, the body can survive conditions that would normally be fatal. Clara nodded slowly. So your treatments are neurological? Primarily. But many survivors say they don't remember the treatment process. Harrow's expression didn't change. Serious illness often affects memory. Clara studied him carefully. I spoke with several former patients, she said. And they all survived. Harrow nodded once. But they also described emotional changes, such as loss of feeling. For the first time, Harrow paused. Recovery from trauma can be psychologically complicated, he said calmly. Clara leaned forward. Some patients say they feel empty. Harrow's eyes remained steady. Human emotion is delicate. Clara hesitated. Then she asked the question that had been haunting her interviews. Do you believe survival always has a cost? Dr. Harrow looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that made the room feel colder. Miss Whitmore. He stood slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, the mountains stretched endlessly beneath dark clouds. Death, Harrow said quietly, is not the worst thing that can happen to a human being. Clara felt a chill crawl down her spine. What do you mean? She asked. Harrow turned back toward her. His expression was thoughtful, almost philosophical. Human beings fear death above all else, he said. But that fear is misplaced. Clara watched him carefully. What should we fear instead? Harrow returned to his chair. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Clara as if measuring her reaction. Then he changed the subject. "You wanted a tour of the facility," he said. "Yes, that can be arranged." Clara relaxed slightly, but Harrow raised a finger. "There are certain areas of the hospital that must remain restricted." Clara's curiosity sharpened. "Restricted?" "For patient privacy," he explained. "Of course." But Clara remembered the blueprints. The missing floor. "The hospital only has 4 floors," she asked casually. Harrow's eyes flickered briefly toward the desk. "Yes." Clara tilted her head. "That's strange." "Why?" "The building plans I saw showed a basement level." The room fell silent. For the first time since the interview began, Dr. Elias Harrow looked uncomfortable. It lasted less than a second. Then his calm smile returned. "Old plans," he said lightly. "The basement was never completed." Clara nodded slowly, but something about his tone felt rehearsed. Too quick. Too careful. She reached for the recorder to end the interview. As she did, Harrow spoke again. "Miss Whitmore." She looked up. "Yes." Harrow's voice was calm, but his eyes were unusually serious now. "You should be careful while investigating miracles." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Harrow held her gaze. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "the reason they work is far worse than the problem they solve." Later that evening, Clara walked through the hospital corridors alone. Dr. Harrow had arranged a short tour before her departure. Nurses passed quietly through the halls. Patients rested peacefully in their rooms. Everything looked normal. Too normal. As Clara waited for the elevator, her eyes drifted again to the button panel. 1, 2, 3, 4. Still no basement. But this time, she noticed something else. A thin line running beneath the panel. A seam in the metal. Almost as if another button had once existed there and had been removed. Clara stared at the panel. Then she pressed 1. As the elevator began to descend, the faint mechanical hum returned beneath her feet. Low. Constant. Coming from somewhere deep below the building. From a floor that, according to the hospital director, did not exist. And as the elevator doors opened onto the quiet lobby, Clara felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. Dr. Elias Harrow was hiding something. Something buried beneath the hospital. Something important enough to erase an entire floor from the building itself. Chapter 4. The floor that doesn't exist. The idea refused to leave Clara Whitmore's mind. Even hours after she left Dr. Elias Harrow's office, the same thought kept circling back, like a persistent whisper she couldn't silence. The basement. Or rather, the missing basement. Hospitals did not simply forget entire floors. Buildings that large required extensive structural planning, utility systems, electrical lines, maintenance corridors. Most of them ran through underground levels. Yet the elevator panel showed nothing below the lobby. And Harrow's explanation had been far too quick. Too polished. As if the answer had been prepared long before Clara ever asked the question. That evening, Clara checked into a small motel in the nearest town. The town itself barely qualified as a town. One diner. One gas station. A handful of quiet houses scattered along the main road. And every single person she encountered seemed aware of the hospital. The diner waitress asked where Clara was visiting from. When Clara mentioned St. Augustine, the woman gave a strange smile. "Most people come here because of it," she said. "Have you been treated there?" Clara asked. The waitress shook her head. "No." "Why not?" The woman hesitated before answering. My brother did. Clara leaned forward slightly. And the waitress wiped the counter slowly. He survived, she said. Clara waited. The woman's smile faded. But he's not really my brother anymore. Clara didn't push further. She had already heard that sentence in too many forms. Later that night, Clara spread her notes across the motel desk. Maps, blueprints, interview transcripts. The hospital building plans lay at the center of everything. According to the architectural documents, St. Augustine Hospital had originally been designed with 5 floors, 4 above ground, and 1 underground level labeled Ward 0. The label itself bothered Clara. Hospitals usually numbered their floors sequentially: basement, first floor, second floor. But Ward 0 sounded deliberate, like something intentionally placed outside the normal structure. She studied the blueprint carefully. The underground level was enormous, almost the same size as the floors above it. Long corridors, multiple sealed rooms, and at the center, one massive chamber. The room had no windows, no external walls, just a thick square structure surrounded by smaller rooms labeled observation and monitoring. Clara traced the layout with her finger. What were they watching? She murmured. And why hide it? The next morning, Clara returned to the hospital. The valley was wrapped in fog when she arrived. The building appeared out of the mist slowly, its white stone walls rising like a monument from the mountainside. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before. Perfect, controlled, calm, too calm. Inside the lobby, the same receptionist greeted her politely. Good morning, Miss Whitmore. Clara nodded. Good morning. I didn't expect you back so soon. I had a few more questions. The receptionist smiled. Dr. Harrow is currently unavailable. That's fine, Clara replied. I'd just like to walk around a bit. The receptionist didn't object. Of course. Clara walked toward the elevators again. But this time, instead of pressing a button immediately, she stood quietly and watched. A nurse stepped inside the elevator and pressed 3. The doors closed. Moments later, another staff member approached, a young orderly pushing an empty wheelchair. He entered the elevator. Clara noticed something strange. The orderly hesitated before pressing a button. For a brief moment, his finger hovered beneath the one. Then he quickly pressed 2. But Clara had seen it. A subtle movement. A place where a button should have been. Beneath the visible panel. Hidden. Her pulse quickened. Clara waited until the lobby cleared. Then she stepped into the elevator alone. The door slid shut. She studied the panel again. 4 buttons. Nothing else. But now that she looked closely, she saw it. A tiny seam along the bottom edge of the metal plate. Almost invisible. She pressed her thumb against it. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. The elevator remained still. Clara sighed. Maybe she was imagining things. She pressed 2. The elevator began to move upward. Then something unexpected happened. Halfway between floors, the elevator slowed. Just slightly. Barely noticeable. But Clara felt it. A tiny hesitation. As if the elevator had briefly considered stopping somewhere else. Somewhere below. The moment passed. The elevator continued upward. The doors opened onto the second floor. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic. Patients rested quietly in their rooms. A nurse passed Clara with a polite nod. Everything appeared ordinary. But Clara wasn't looking at the patients. She was watching the staff, watching their behavior, watching their patterns, and something about the hospital routine felt strange. Doctors and nurses moved through the corridors calmly, but every so often, one of them glanced toward the far end of the hallway, where a locked security door stood. The door required a key card. Above it, a sign read, "Authorized personnel only." Clara walked past casually. The door had no windows, no visible keypad, just a smooth metal surface and a card scanner. She listened carefully. Behind the door, nothing. No voices, no machines, just silence. But the nurses seemed aware of it, aware of something beyond it. Later that afternoon, Clara found herself standing once again beside the elevators. This time, a nurse stood beside her, an older woman with tired eyes. Clara decided to try something. "Busy day?" Clara asked casually. The nurse shrugged. "Fairly normal." Clara nodded toward the elevator. "Do you work all the floors?" "Yes. Even the basement." The nurse froze. It lasted less than a second. Then she smiled politely. "There is no basement." Clara pretended to look confused. "Oh, I thought." "No basement," the nurse repeated firmly. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. The nurse stepped inside quickly. But before the doors closed, Clara heard something. A sound. Soft. Deep. Almost like a long breath. Not from the hallway. Not from the elevator. But from somewhere beneath the building. A low mechanical vibration followed it. The elevator doors closed. Clara stood alone in the corridor. Her heart beat a little faster now, because she had heard that sound before. When the elevator descended. A hum. A vibration. Something active beneath the hospital. Something large. And something very much alive. That evening, Clara returned to the motel again. But this time she didn't sleep. Instead, she stared at the blueprint of Ward 0. At the massive chamber in the center. At the observation room surrounding it. At the strange designation. Ward 0. Not patient ward. Not research lab. Just 0. Like the place where everything began. Or the place where something was contained. Clara slowly closed the blueprint. Then she whispered a thought she couldn't ignore anymore. What are they hiding down there? Outside the motel window, the mountains sat quietly beneath the dark sky. Miles away, St. Augustine Hospital glowed faintly in the valley. Inside its spotless corridors, doctors and nurses moved through the night shift. Patients slept peacefully in their rooms. Machines hummed softly. And deep beneath the building, behind walls that officially did not exist, something waited in the dark. Breathing. Patient. Hungry. Chapter 5. The Patients Who Never Leave. The first missing name appeared just after midnight. Clara Whitmore sat alone in the dim light of her motel room, her laptop casting pale shadows across the scattered papers on the desk. Outside, the town had fallen completely silent. The diner had closed hours earlier. Even the highway seemed to have forgotten this place existed. Only the mountains remained awake. Clara scrolled slowly through the hospital records she had spent the evening gathering. Most of the documents were public archives, medical reports, research summaries, interviews with Dr. Elias Harrow from decades earlier. But buried inside those files were lists of early patients treated during the hospital's first few years of operation. Names, dates, diagnoses, discharge reports. At first glance, Everything appeared perfectly organized. But Clara had spent 15 years finding cracks inside perfect stories. And tonight she had found the first one. She highlighted the name again. Patient Gregory H. Lawson. Admitted March 4th, Year 1. Diagnosis: late-stage lymphoma. There was no discharge date. Clara frowned. That alone wasn't unusual. Sometimes records were incomplete. But when she searched the National Death Registry, Gregory Lawson didn't appear there either. No death certificate. No obituary. No record of burial. Just absence. Clara leaned closer to the screen. Maybe it was an error. Maybe the patient had moved abroad. Maybe the records were simply outdated. But something about the name bothered her. So she searched again. And found another. Patient Alicia Romero. Admitted during the hospital's second year. Terminal autoimmune disease. No discharge record. No death certificate. No trace. Clara's fingers slowed on the keyboard. Then she found a third. And a fourth. By 2 in the morning, Clara had discovered 8 patients from the hospital's early years who had seemingly vanished. They had been admitted, but they had never been discharged. And they had never died. Clara stared at the list. Because the hospital had proudly advertised a perfect survival rate, which meant none of these patients had died inside the building. But if they hadn't died, and they hadn't left, then there was only one possibility left. They were still there. The next morning, Clara returned to St. Augustine Hospital with a new purpose. The valley looked different in daylight. Less mysterious. Less threatening. But Clara knew better now. She walked through the lobby calmly, nodding politely to the receptionist. "Back again?" the woman asked. Clara smiled, just gathering a few more details. The receptionist didn't question her. Clara stepped into the elevator. Again she studied the panel. 4 floors. No basement. No ward 0. But the faint hum beneath the elevator was still there. Always there. Like a distant machine, breathing somewhere deep below the hospital. The doors opened onto the 3rd floor. Clara stepped out. This floor was quieter than the others. Fewer patients. Longer corridors. The lighting here seemed slightly dimmer. Clara walked slowly past the patient rooms, pretending to read the information boards outside each door. Most rooms were occupied, but occasionally she passed one that was completely empty. Perfectly clean. Almost untouched. She stopped beside one door labeled Room 318. The patient information board had been removed. No name. No diagnosis. Just an empty plastic frame. Clara pushed the door open gently. The room inside was spotless. The bed was made. The machines were silent. But the room didn't feel unused. The air smelled faintly stale. Like a place that had once been occupied. And recently emptied. Clara stepped inside. The silence pressed against her ears. Then she noticed something strange. Scratched into the metal bed frame. The letters were faint. Almost invisible unless the light hit them at the right angle. Clara leaned closer. The message was uneven. Carved slowly. Painstakingly. As if written by someone very weak. 3 words. Don't trust them. Clara stepped back. Her heart began to beat faster. That afternoon, Clara found the person she had been hoping to meet. A former nurse. Her name was Lena Hartwell. She had worked at St. Augustine Hospital during its early years, long before the place gained its reputation as a miracle facility. They met in the same diner Clara had visited the night before. Lena looked nervous from the moment she sat down. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred her coffee. "You said this conversation is off the record," she said quietly. Clara nodded. "Completely." Lena glanced toward the diner windows, as if expecting someone to be watching. "I only worked there for 2 years," she said. That was enough. Clara opened her notebook. "I'm investigating something unusual about the hospital's early patients." Lena gave a humorless laugh. "Unusual is a polite word." Clara leaned forward. "Do you remember patients who were never discharged?" Lena's stirring spoon stopped moving. Slowly she lifted her eyes. "How many names did you find?" Clara felt a chill. 8. Lena nodded grimly. "There were more." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "What happened to them?" Lena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked a question of her own. "Have you heard of Ward 0? Clara's pulse quickened. "Yes." Lena's voice dropped to a whisper. "That's where they went." The diner seemed quieter now. Even the kitchen noise had faded. Clara leaned closer. "What is Ward 0? She asked. Lena shook her head slowly. "I never saw the inside." "Then how do you know about it?" "Because I helped move the patients." Clara's pen froze above the notebook. "Move them where?" Lena swallowed. "Down." "Down where?" "Beneath the hospital." Clara's voice dropped. "The basement." Lena nodded once. "But the hospital doesn't call it a basement." "What do they call it?" Lena looked directly at Clara. "Containment." Clara felt a cold ripple run down her spine. "Containment for what?" she asked. Lena hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the coffee mug. Then she said something that made Clara wish she hadn't asked. "The first patient." Clara blinked. "What first patient?" Lena's eyes flicked nervously toward the windows again. Then she leaned closer across the table. "There was someone in Ward 0 long before the hospital opened," she whispered. "Someone they found during construction." Clara's heartbeat quickened. "Found?" Lena nodded slowly. "Buried." Clara's pen slipped from her fingers. "Buried," she repeated. "Yes." "Alive." Lena closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, the fear inside them was unmistakable. "Yes," she whispered. "But that wasn't the worst part." Clara leaned forward. "What was?" Lena's voice dropped to a trembling breath. "The worst part was that he still is." Chapter 6. The first patient. The rain began just after midnight. Clara Whitmore lay awake in the narrow motel bed, staring at the ceiling while Lena Hartwell's words replayed again and again in her mind. The first patient. Buried. Still alive. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the motel window, a soft, rhythmic sound that filled the darkness. Clara had always found rain calming. Tonight it felt like a countdown. Because if Lena was telling the truth, then St. Augustine Hospital had not begun as a medical breakthrough. It had begun as a discovery. And discoveries, especially the buried kind, rarely came without consequences. Clara rolled out of bed and sat at the desk again. The blueprint of Ward 0 lay open under the desk lamp. The central chamber stared back at her like a hollow eye. She whispered the words again. The first patient. But Lena had said something else too. Something that hadn't stopped bothering Clara since she heard it. They found him during construction. Clara opened her laptop. If the hospital had discovered something buried beneath the construction site 30 years ago, there might be records, old news articles, local reports, anything mentioning unusual delays or accidents during the hospital's construction. She typed slowly. St. Augustine Hospital construction history. The first few results were predictable. Medical journals praising Dr. Elias Harrow's groundbreaking neurological research. But buried several pages deep, Clara found something different. A scanned article from a small local newspaper. The headline read, "Construction halted after strange discovery." Clara leaned closer to the screen. The article was dated 31 years earlier, 1 year before the hospital officially opened. It described a temporary halt in construction after workers uncovered what was described only as a preserved human body beneath the foundation site. Clara read the line again. Preserved. Not skeleton. Not remains. A body. The article continued. Construction workers reportedly discovered the figure buried several meters beneath the earth. At first, authorities believed it to be an archaeological find. But the report stopped abruptly after that. The final paragraph simply stated that the body had been transferred to Dr. Harrow's research team for medical examination. No follow-up articles. No police investigation. No explanation of where the body came from. Just silence. Clara leaned back slowly. 31 years ago, construction workers had unearthed a body beneath the future hospital site. And somehow, that body had become the hospital's first patient. The next morning, Clara drove to the town's small public library. If the discovery had happened locally, the town might have kept records the internet no longer carried. The library was old and quiet, with wooden shelves that smelled faintly of dust and paper. A single elderly librarian sat behind the desk. Clara approached carefully. "I'm looking for local newspaper archives," she said. The librarian nodded. "Back room." Clara spent the next 2 hours digging through microfilm reels. Old headlines flickered across the viewing screen. Town council meetings. High school sports victories. Weather reports. Then she found it. The week construction had stopped. Multiple short articles described the discovery beneath the hospital site. Workers had uncovered what they initially believed to be an ancient burial. But when the medical team arrived, everything changed. One article contained a sentence Clara read 3 times before believing it. Doctors on site reported faint neurological activity within the discovered body. Clara stared at the screen. Neurological activity. Brain activity. Inside a body buried underground. The article continued. The body had no pulse. No measurable breathing. No detectable heartbeat. But somehow, the brain was still active. Clara's stomach twisted. Because that meant the impossible. The body was technically dead, but the mind inside it was still alive. Later that afternoon, Clara returned to the diner. Lena Hartwell was already waiting in a booth near the back. She looked more nervous than before. "You came back," Lena said quietly. "I found something," Clara replied. She slid a printed copy of the old article across the table. Lena looked at it for a long moment. Then she nodded. "They told us about that discovery when I first started working there." Clara leaned forward. "What exactly did they find?" Lena took a slow breath. "A man." "How old?" "No one knew." "Why not?" "Because the body was wrong." Clara felt a chill creep across her skin. "Wrong how?" Lena lowered her voice. "The doctor said his tissues were centuries old." Clara blinked. "But they hadn't decayed." Clara stared at her. "That's impossible." Lena gave a thin smile. "That's exactly what Dr. Harrow said." The waitress passed by with coffee, but neither woman touched it. Clara asked the question she feared most. What happened after they found him? Lena rubbed her hands together. They moved him into a temporary lab. Was he conscious? No. But the brain activity continued. Clara's heart pounded. For how long? Lena met her eyes. It never stopped. The diner lights hummed softly above them. Lena continued. At first the doctors thought it was some kind of rare neurological anomaly, maybe a coma state unlike anything recorded before. And was it? Lena shook her head slowly. They started noticing something strange. What? People who worked near the lab began reporting physical changes. Clara frowned. Good changes. Lena nodded. Chronic pain disappeared, minor illnesses vanished, even old injuries started healing. Clara felt her pulse quicken. You're saying the body was curing people. That's what the doctors believed. Clara sat back slowly. And that's when they built the hospital. Yes. Specifically around him. Lena nodded again. They moved him into the underground chamber during construction. Clara pictured the blueprint again. The massive room in the center of Ward 0. So every patient who comes to St. Augustine, Lena finished the sentence for her, gets placed near him. Clara felt a growing dread forming in her chest. That's how the miracle works. But that's not the whole story, Lena said quietly. Clara looked up. What do you mean? Lena hesitated. The first few years, the doctors thought they had discovered the greatest medical breakthrough in human history. Clara nodded slowly. But then the side effects started. Clara already knew what she was about to say. The survivors, Clara whispered. Yes. Emotionally empty. Lena's face darkened. They weren't just empty. Clara waited. They were drained. A cold silence filled the booth. Clara felt the pieces beginning to connect. You think the body was taking something from them? Lena's voice dropped to a whisper. That's exactly what Dr. Harrow realized. Clara's stomach tightened. What was it taking? Lena stared down at the table. When she finally answered, her voice trembled. The part of people that makes them human. Clara felt the words settle in the air between them. Then she asked the question neither of them wanted to say aloud. Why? Lena lifted her eyes slowly. Her expression held a quiet horror that had clearly lived with her for decades. Because whatever they found buried beneath that mountain was starving. Chapter 7. The Thing Beneath the Hospital. The fog returned to the valley that night. From the highway above the mountains, St. Augustine Hospital looked like a distant lighthouse, its windows glowing softly through the mist, calm and reassuring to anyone passing by. But Clara Whitmore now knew better. Hospitals saved lives. This one fed something. She sat in her parked car at the far edge of the hospital grounds, the engine off, the dashboard clock glowing faintly in the darkness. 11:42 p.m. Most of the hospital lights were still on, but the parking lot had emptied considerably since sunset. Only a handful of vehicles remained. Night shift. Quiet hours. The time when things moved unnoticed. Clara checked the small digital recorder in her pocket, then the camera in her bag. She wasn't entirely sure what she would find tonight. But Lena's words had changed everything. The first patient. Still alive. Still feeding. And if that was true, then the secret of St. Augustine Hospital was not hidden in the upper floors. It was buried beneath them. The staff entrance door closed behind Clara with a quiet click. She had waited until a nurse exited for a smoke break, slipping through the door just before it shut. The hallway inside was dimly lit. Night shift lighting. Soft, low illumination meant to keep patients resting. Clara moved quietly. Her footsteps echoed faintly against the polished floor. She had memorized the layout earlier that day. The security door she had noticed before, the one labeled authorized personnel only, was 3 corridors away. The hospital felt different at night. Less like a place of healing. More like a place holding its breath. Clara turned the corner. And there it was. The security door. The hallway around it was empty. No nurses. No orderlies. Just the soft hum of distant machines. Clara approached slowly. The metal surface of the door looked even heavier up close. Industrial. Built to contain something. She tried the handle. Locked. Of course. But the keycard scanner beside it blinked with a small green light. Clara remembered something Lena had said during their conversation. Staff changed shifts around midnight. Which meant one thing. Someone would eventually come through that door. Clara stepped quietly into a nearby supply closet and left the door cracked open just enough to watch the hallway. Then she waited. 20 minutes passed. The hallway remained silent. Clara's breathing slowed as she adjusted to the darkness. Then footsteps approached. Soft. Steady. A nurse walked down the corridor carrying a clipboard. She stopped at the security door. Clara held her breath. The nurse swiped her keycard. The scanner beeped softly. The heavy door clicked open. The nurse stepped through. And just before the door closed again, Clara moved. She slipped out of the closet, crossed the hallway quickly, and caught the door before it shut. It opened just enough for her to slide inside. Then it sealed behind her with a dull metallic thud. The corridor beyond the security door was colder. The lighting here was harsher, more clinical. Concrete wall replaced the polished hospital surfaces of the upper floors. Pipes ran along the ceiling. Heavy electrical cables snaked down the walls. Clara followed the nurse from a distance. At the end of the hallway stood something Clara had been searching for since her first visit. An elevator. But unlike the public elevators upstairs, this one had only 2 buttons. Ground. And B1. Clara's pulse quickened. The basement. The floor that didn't exist. The nurse pressed B1. The elevator doors closed. Clara rushed forward, just in time to slip inside before they sealed completely. The nurse barely glanced at her, too tired to question another staff member. The elevator began to descend. Clara felt it immediately. The same low vibration she had noticed before, but stronger now. The deeper the elevator traveled, the louder the hum became. It wasn't just machinery. It was something else. A slow, rhythmic sound, like breathing. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. The basement corridor was enormous. Concrete walls stretched in every direction. Industrial lights flickered faintly overhead. Large steel doors lined the hallway, each labeled with small black signs. Observation 1. Observation 2. MONITORNG room. Doctors moved quietly between rooms, studying computer screens and medical charts. No one noticed Clara. Everyone here looked exhausted, focused, nervous, like people working beside something they didn't fully understand. Clara walked slowly down the hallway. The humming sound grew louder with every step. At the end of the corridor stood a massive circular door. Thick steel, reinforced hinges, a small window made of heavy glass. Above the door, A single word had been painted in black letters. Containment. Clara's stomach tightened. She approached the window slowly and looked inside. The chamber was enormous, at least 50 feet across. The walls were lined with medical equipment, monitors, cables, machines Clara couldn't even identify. But none of that mattered, because in the center of the room, something lay on a raised platform. Clara froze. It looked like a man, but only barely. The body was skeletal, the skin stretched tightly across bones that looked centuries old. Tubes and wires ran from every part of the body into machines surrounding the platform. The chest barely moved, but it moved. Breathing. The skull-like face stared upward, eyes closed. Yet every monitor around the chamber flashed with activity. Brain activity. Massive amounts of it. Clara pressed closer to the glass. And then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The cables attached to the creature didn't only lead to the machines. Some of them extended through the walls, upward, into the hospital above, into the patient rooms, into the very structure of the building itself. Clara whispered the realization. The hospital. Behind her, a voice finished the sentence. Is connected to him. Clara turned sharply. Dr. Elias Harrow stood in the doorway. His face was calm, almost peaceful. You weren't supposed to see this yet, he said quietly. Clara stared back at the chamber. That thing. It's a man, Harrow corrected gently. No, Clara whispered. That's not a man. Harrow glanced through the window. Not anymore. Clara forced herself to ask the question. What is it? Harrow's voice dropped to a quiet tone. Something ancient. Clara's heart pounded. You built an entire hospital around it. Yes. Why? Harrow looked at her calmly. Because when it feeds, people stop dying. Clara felt a wave of horror wash over her. And the survivors, she asked. The ones who leave empty. Harrow nodded slowly. A necessary cost. Clara looked back at the skeletal figure in the chamber. The monitors beeped steadily. Brainwaves danced across the screens. Alive. Awake. Hungry. What does it take from them? Clara whispered. Harrow answered without hesitation. The soul. The word echoed through the corridor. Clara stared at him. You're killing people. No. Harrow's expression remained calm. We're saving them. He gestured toward the chamber. That thing was buried beneath this mountain for centuries. Clara's voice trembled. Why? Harrow met her eyes. Because someone, a very long time ago, knew exactly what it was capable of. Chapter 8. The Price of Survival. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Clara Whitmore stood frozen beside the reinforced glass window, staring into the containment chamber, while Dr. Elias Harrow watched her calmly from the hallway. Inside the room, the ancient body lay motionless on the raised platform. Its skin clung tightly to bone, stretched thin like parchment left too long in the sun. Tubes and cables fed into its limbs, chest, and skull, carrying endless streams of data into the surrounding machines. The monitors pulsed with restless brainwaves. Alive. Not just alive. Active. Clara felt a slow dread forming deep in her chest. It's thinking, she whispered. Dr. Harrow nodded. Yes. Clara turned toward him. How long? Harrow didn't hesitate. At least several centuries. Clara felt the weight of those words sink in. That's impossible. Many things are, Harrow replied softly, until someone proves otherwise. Clara looked back through the glass. The creature's chest rose and fell slowly. One shallow breath every several seconds. How was it still alive when they found it? She asked. Harrow folded his hands behind his back. We still don't fully understand the biology involved. That's not an answer. No, he agreed calmly, but it's the truth. He stepped closer to the window. When construction workers discovered the body, they believed it was a preserved corpse. But when our instruments detected neurological activity, he paused. We realized we were looking at something extraordinary. Clara crossed her arms. So you experimented on it. Harrow tilted his head slightly. We studied it. You built a hospital around it. Yes. Clara's voice hardened. Because it could heal people. Harrow nodded. Eventually, we discovered that anyone placed within a certain proximity experienced dramatic cellular repair. Diseases reversed, tissue regenerated, even neurological damage began healing. Clara remembered the interviews. The survivors. The emptiness in their voices. But the side effects, she said. Harrow sighed softly. Yes. Clara turned to face him fully. What exactly happens to the patients? Harrow glanced back at the chamber. The organism consumes something. Something, Clara repeated. Yes. What? Harrow studied her carefully. Emotion, he said. Clara shook her head. That's not possible. It consumes the neurological structures responsible for emotional processing, Harrow clarified. Fear, love, grief, joy, those parts of the human mind. Clara felt sick. You mean the soul? Harrow gave a faint shrug. That word carries religious implications. I prefer measurable definitions. But the result is the same. Yes. Clara's voice trembled with anger now. You're feeding people to it. No, Harrow said calmly, we're saving them. Clara laughed bitterly. They leave empty. They leave alive. The words hung heavily between them. Clara looked back at the creature again. The ancient thing beneath the hospital. Its brainwaves flickered across the monitors like restless lightning. And if you stop feeding it, she asked quietly. Harrow's expression changed slightly. The calm certainty faded just enough for Clara to notice. We've never attempted that. Why not? Because when the organism was first discovered, Harrow paused. It was far weaker. Clara frowned. Weak. Harrow nodded. It barely showed measurable activity. But now, Harrow gestured toward the monitors. Now it's stronger than ever. Clara followed his gaze. The brain activity patterns were intense. Constant. Powerful. How many patients? She asked. Harrow didn't answer immediately. Over 30 years, Clara continued slowly. How many people have you treated here? Harrow finally spoke. Several thousand. The number made Clara feel dizzy. Several thousand souls, she whispered. Harrow didn't correct her this time. A sudden sound broke the silence. A low vibration rolled through the corridor. Clara felt it beneath her feet. The machines inside the chamber began beeping faster. Harrow frowned slightly. That's unusual. Clara looked at the monitors. The brainwave activity was spiking. Sharp bursts of electrical energy flashed across the screens. What's happening? She asked. Harrow stepped toward a nearby console. It's responding. To what? Harrow didn't answer. He studied the monitors carefully. The patterns looked different now. More organized. More focused. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. It knows we're here, she whispered. Harrow glanced at her. That would be impossible. Inside the chamber, the creature's breathing changed. The slow rhythm grew slightly faster. The chest rose and fell with greater strength. Clara's heart pounded. "Doctor!" Harrow's eyes remained fixed on the monitor. The brainwave patterns were stabilizing. But they weren't random anymore. They formed repeating pulses, almost like signals. Clara felt a terrible realization creeping into her mind. "How long has it been conscious?" she asked quietly. Harrow hesitated. "We assumed it remained in a coma-like state." "That's not what I asked." Harrow didn't answer. Clara stared through the glass again. The creature looked exactly the same. Eyes closed, body still. But something felt different now. More aware. Like a sleeping animal sensing movement nearby. "What if it's been awake this whole time?" Clara whispered. Harrow shook his head. "That would mean—" He stopped speaking. Clara finished the thought. "That it knows exactly what you've been doing." The machines continued humming. The brainwaves pulsed slowly. Rhythmically. Intentional. Clara felt a growing dread inside her chest. "What if it isn't just feeding?" she asked. Harrow turned toward her. "What do you mean?" Clara's voice dropped. "What if it's learning?" The room fell silent. Harrow looked back at the monitors. The patterns continued repeating. Ordered. Precise. Clara stepped closer to the glass again. And then something happened. So small. So subtle. She almost missed it. The creature's finger twitched. Clara froze. "Did you see that?" Harrow stared at the body. Nothing moved. But the brainwaves spiked again. The machines beeped faster. Clara's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "It's waking up." Harrow's calm mask finally cracked. That shouldn't be possible. But Clara knew something he didn't. Thousands of patients had fed the thing beneath this hospital. Thousands of minds. Thousands of memories. Thousands of pieces of humanity. And if it had been consuming all of them for 30 years, then the creature beneath the hospital wasn't just alive anymore. It was becoming something else. Something smarter. Something stronger. And maybe something ready to wake up. Chapter 9. The Feeding Cycle. The machines were no longer calm. The quiet rhythm that had once filled the containment corridor had turned sharp and urgent. Monitors flashed warnings across their screens, and several technicians hurried between control panels with growing concern. Clara Whitmore stood frozen beside the glass, watching the skeletal figure at the center of the chamber. It still lay motionless, but the machines around it told a different story. Brain activity surged across the monitors in powerful waves. Not random, not chaotic, structured, deliberate. "Dr. Clara whispered, "This isn't normal, is it?" Dr. Elias Harrow didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained locked on the monitors, his fingers moving rapidly across a keyboard at the nearby console. "No," he said finally. Clara felt a chill run through her. "What's happening?" Harrow adjusted several controls before responding. "The organism is accelerating." "Accelerating what?" "Neural output." Clara stared at the monitor screens. The patterns looked like lightning storms trapped inside glass. "How strong is it compared to before?" Harrow's voice lowered. "Approximately 4 times higher than its average activity." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. 4 times? Harrow nodded slowly. "That level of activity has never occurred before." Clara swallowed. "What changed?" Harrow didn't answer. Because they both already knew. 30 years. Thousands of patients. Thousands of stolen emotions. thousands of minds partially stripped of their humanity. The creature beneath the hospital had been feeding for decades. And now, it was finally strong enough to do something new. Another technician rushed into the corridor. "Dr. Harrow," he said breathlessly. Harrow turned. "What is it?" "The upper wards are reporting unusual patient behavior." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of behavior?" Harrow asked. "Several patients are attempting to leave their rooms." "That's not unusual." The technician shook his head. "They're all moving toward the elevators." Clara's pulse quickened. "How many?" Harrow asked. "8 so far." Harrow frowned. "Security should redirect them." They tried. The technician hesitated. "But the patients aren't responding." Clara felt cold. "Not responding how?" "They're not speaking." Clara whispered the answer before the technician could. "They're being called." Both men looked at her. Clara stepped closer to the glass window. "You said it feeds on emotions," she said quietly. "Yes," Harrow replied. "And the patients who leave the hospital are empty." "Yes." Clara's voice trembled. "But the ones still inside." She pointed toward the upper floors. "Still have something left." Harrow's expression darkened. "You think it's drawing them closer?" Clara nodded. The creature beneath the hospital had consumed pieces of thousands of minds. Fragments of fear, fragments of love, fragments of thought. And now it was using them. Like signals, like bait. A loud clang echoed down the hallway. The containment door at the far end of the corridor swung open. 2 security guards rushed inside. "They're coming down," one of them said. "Who is?" Harrow asked. "The patients." Clara looked toward the elevator. The doors slid open. 8 people stepped out. Men, women, young, old. Hospital gowns fluttered softly as they walked. Their movements were slow and mechanical, like sleepwalkers. None of them spoke. None of them looked around. They walked directly toward the containment chamber. Clara felt her chest tighten. "They're being pulled," she whispered. Harrow stepped forward. "Stop them." The guards moved quickly, blocking the hallway. But the patients didn't react. They kept walking. Slow, silent, focused. The guards grabbed the first patient, a middle-aged man recovering from heart surgery. The man didn't resist. But he didn't stop walking either. His feet dragged against the floor as if something invisible were pulling him forward. "Sir," one guard shouted. The patient didn't blink. His eyes were fixed on the containment chamber. Clara followed his gaze. The skeletal creature inside the room lay perfectly still. But the monitors were exploding with activity now. The brainwaves pulsed with violent intensity. It was calling them. Clara stepped closer to the glass. The patients gathered behind her now, standing quietly in a line outside the chamber. Their breathing slowed. Their eyes stared forward. The machines hummed louder. Clara felt something strange inside her mind. A faint pressure, like the beginning of a headache. But deeper. "Do you feel that?" she asked quietly. Harrow didn't answer. Because he felt it too. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. And suddenly, images flashed through her thoughts. Not memories. Not dreams. Something else. Cold. Ancient. Hungry. She gasped and opened her eyes. The creature's chest rose sharply. The breath it released sounded louder now. Stronger. Like air rushing through a cavern. Clara's voice trembled. "It's communicating." Harrow looked horrified. That's impossible. But Clara felt it again. That pressure. Inside her mind. The faintest whisper. Not words. Not yet. But intention. Hunger. The patients behind her stepped forward simultaneously. The guards tried to hold them back. But the patients were stronger now. Driven. Focused. The creature beneath the hospital had begun a new feeding cycle. But this time, it wasn't waiting for doctors to bring it victims. It was calling them itself. Harrow slammed his hand on the console. "We have to sedate them," he shouted. The technicians rushed to prepare injections. But Clara wasn't watching the patients anymore. She was watching the creature. Something had changed. Something subtle. Something terrifying. The eyes. They were no longer completely closed. Just slightly open. A thin sliver of darkness stared out from beneath the skeletal eyelids. Watching. Learning. Waiting. Clara felt the whisper inside her mind grow louder. Not words. Not language. But a feeling. A promise. The thing beneath the hospital had fed for 30 years. But now, it wanted more. And the feeding had only just begun. Chapter 10. The miracle must continue. The first scream came from the elevator. It was short, cut off quickly, but it shattered the fragile calm that had once filled the underground corridors of St. Augustine Hospital. Clara Whitmore turned sharply toward the sound. More patients were arriving. The elevator doors opened again. 3 more figures stepped out. Hospital gowns. Blank expressions. Slow, determined steps toward the containment chamber. The guards moved to stop them, but their movements had already grown uncertain. Something in the air had changed. A pressure. A quiet vibration that seemed to pulse through the concrete walls and metal floors. Clara felt it in her chest, like standing too close to a powerful speaker. A deep frequency humming through bone and blood. Behind the glass, the creature's brain activity surged again. The monitors screamed warnings. The skeletal chest rose higher with each breath. Stronger. Faster. Dr. Elias Harrow stared at the screens, his carefully maintained composure finally slipping. "It's never been this active," he whispered. Clara stepped closer to him. "You said it feeds on emotion," she said. "Yes. And now it's pulling people here." Harrow nodded slowly. "It's learned." Clara felt the words settle like ice in her veins. 30 years of stolen minds. Thousands of fragments of human thought. Fear. Hope. Memory. All absorbed into the creature beneath the hospital. It hadn't just been feeding. It had been studying humanity. And now, it understood how to control it. Behind Clara, the patients continued gathering in the corridor. More had arrived. Some limped. Some moved stiffly with fresh surgical scars. But all of them walked with the same silent determination. Toward the chamber. Toward the thing calling them. Security struggled to hold them back. But the guards' movement slowed. Their eyes unfocused. The pressure in the air grew stronger. Clara turned toward Dr. Harrow. "You can't stop this, can you?" Harrow didn't answer. Because he already knew the truth. The machines surrounding the creature had been designed to contain something weak. Something barely alive. But after decades of feeding, the thing beneath the hospital was no longer weak. The containment systems had become little more than decoration. The first patient collapsed beside the chamber door. A young woman recovering from pneumonia. Her body convulsed once, then went still. Clara rushed forward. But when she reached the woman, she realized something horrifying. The patient wasn't dead. Her heart still beat. Her lungs still moved. But her eyes were empty. Completely empty. Clara felt a hand grab her arm. "Harrow." "It took everything," he whispered. Clara stared at the woman. "She's alive." "Yes. But there's nothing left." Harrow nodded slowly. "The feeding has accelerated." More patients dropped to their knees. One by one. Each collapse accompanied by another violent spike on the monitors. The creature was consuming them faster now. Directly. Without the careful distance the hospital had once maintained. Clara looked through the glass again. And this time, the creature looked back. Both eyes were open. Black. Endless. Ancient. A thin smile slowly stretched across the skeletal face. Clara staggered backward. "It's awake." Dr. Harrow didn't deny it. The whisper inside Clara's mind returned. Stronger now. Not vague. Not distant. Clear. A voice. Ancient. Cold. More. The word echoed through her thoughts like thunder. Clara clutched her head. "You hear it too," she said to Harrow. Harrow's pale face confirmed it. "Yes." Clara looked around the corridor. The patients had all collapsed now. Bodies scattered across the concrete floor. Alive, but hollow. The creature's feeding cycle had ended. For now, the machine stabilized. The brainwave activity slowed slightly. But the eyes inside the chamber remained open. Watching. Aware. The creature spoke again, inside Clara's mind. "More." Harrow closed his eyes. "We created this," he whispered. Clara looked at him. "You fed it. We saved people. You built a feeding ground." Harrow shook his head slowly. "You don't understand." Clara's voice hardened. "Then explain." Harrow gestured toward the corridor. Toward the unconscious patients. "They're alive," he said. Clara stared at him in disbelief. "They're empty. But they're breathing." The terrible logic settled in the silence. Harrow looked back at the creature. "If we stop feeding it." Clara finished the thought. "It wakes completely." Harrow nodded. "And when it wakes." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Clara had seen the brainwave activity. The intelligence forming behind those ancient eyes. If the creature ever reached full consciousness, nothing inside the hospital would stop it. Maybe nothing on Earth could. Clara whispered the realization. "You're not running a hospital." Harrow nodded grimly. "No. You're running a prison." "Yes." Clara looked back at the creature. The thin smile remained. It was patient. It understood now. Sooner or later, more patients would come. More souls. More pieces of humanity to consume. And with every feeding, it would grow stronger. Clara stepped back slowly. "So what happens now?" she asked. Harrow's answer came quietly. "We continue." Clara stared at him. "You can't be serious." "If we stop," he said calmly, "the creature wakes fully. And if you continue." Harrow gestured toward the upper floors. "The world keeps believing in miracles." Clara looked at the unconscious patients. Then at the ancient thing smiling behind the glass. The hospital where no one died. The hospital where people walked out alive. But left something behind. Clara felt the whisper brush against her thoughts one final time. "More." Harrow turned toward the corridor. "Security will escort you out," he said quietly. Clara didn't move. "You expect me to keep this secret?" Harrow met her eyes. "Miss Whitmore." He gestured toward the chamber. "If the world learns the truth." Clara understood immediately. Thousands of desperate people would come, not to destroy the creature, but to use it, to bargain with it, to feed it willingly in exchange for survival. Humanity would deliver itself directly into its hands. Clara felt a terrible certainty settle over her. The hospital's secret would never stay buried forever. But until that day came, the miracle would continue. Patients would arrive. Bodies would be healed. Souls would be consumed. And deep beneath the mountains, something ancient would keep growing stronger, waiting patiently for the day. It no longer needed the hospital at all.
Closing chapter.
For 30 years, the world celebrated a miracle. A hospital where no one dies. A place where terminal illness disappears. A place where doctors defeat the one enemy medicine has never conquered. But the truth was never about saving lives. It was about what people are willing to sacrifice to avoid death. Because the patients did survive. Their hearts kept beating. Their bodies walked out of the hospital. Their diseases vanished. But the most important part of them never left the building. Their fear. Their love. Their humanity. All of it fed something ancient beneath the hospital floor. And maybe the most terrifying part of this story is not the creature itself. It's the question it forces us to ask. If you were dying, if you had one chance to live, would you still say no? If the cost was your soul? If this story kept you listening until the end, make sure to subscribe for more dark audiobook stories, because some horrors aren't fiction. Some are just waiting to be discovered.